Hello everyone, my name is Ghelmani. Today I will be presenting our latest work with Professor Amin Hammad titled A Critical Review of Supervised and Reduced Dataset Vision-Based Construction Activity Recognition Methods. Traditionally, construction site monitoring has been performed manually by superintendents on the site. However, manual monitoring can be time-consuming and error-prone, especially on large sites. So over the years, many automated activity monitoring methods have been developed in construction. Also, most of the state-of-the-art automated methods are vision-based because of advantages like these days cameras are installed at most construction sites and they are usually installed at high places and can provide a wide monitoring range. The other advantage is that by using methods developed in the field of computer vision, many high-performing methods have also been developed in construction. However, there are still some challenges. The first is that most of the current methods use supervised learning and so require large annotated datasets, especially for videos that need frame level annotation that can be very time consuming to provide. Another challenge is that in different phases of a construction project, many different types of construction equipment, each with its own set of activities, may be used. So developing a model that can detect all these equipment and activities in a supervised manner would require a very large data set. To address these data-related bottlenecks, reduced dataset methods have begun to gain traction for both equipment detection and activity recognition tasks. Another challenge is developing methods that can provide real-time monitoring information for the emerging construction digital twin systems. Such monitoring information can be provided using edge devices like stationary and moving cameras. Previous review papers have focused on traditional supervised activity recognition methods, so in this work we review the emerging technologies and discuss their potential in construction, particularly for activity recognition. In this section, I will first provide a brief review of the latest supervised activity recognition methods before reviewing the emerging technologies mentioned earlier. Early deep learning-based methods like the one we see in this slide use 2D CNN network to extract features from the input frames, and then afterward the detection results were input into an LSTM model to detect the activity that is taking place. To further improve the detection results in this work in particular, they also exploited the sequential nature of excavator activities by using another LSTM model. However, the main disadvantage of these methods is that spatial and temporal information are processed separately. 3D CNN-based methods alleviate this issue by incorporating the spatiotemporal data extraction into a single architecture. For example, in this figure we can see a multi-stage method that was developed by one of my colleagues. In the first stage, they used the faster RCNN network to detect excavators. After that, the detected excavators were tracked in consecutive frames. Then they cropped the frames around each of the detected equipment. Finally, they used the 3D resonant network for activity recognition, and they also used the center point of the detected bounding boxes to identify the idling state of the equipment. However, multi-stage methods have two main problems. The first is that error propagates from earlier stages to the later ones and degrades the overall model performance. And the second is that each stage needs a separate processing time that, when added together, reduces the inference speed of the model. So to solve these problems, another one of my colleagues proposed a single-stage construction worker activity recognition method. In this method, they used a 3D CNN network to process the input clip, and they also used a 2D CNN network to process the last frame of that clip to provide more precise localization information. After that, the output of the two networks were fused together using the channel fusion and attention module before producing the final output. However, the main problem with this method, which was named YOVO 53, is that it has relatively low per frame performance. So there was a need for a post-processing linking step that can be time consuming depending on the number of frames in the video and the number of detections per frame. To solve this problem, in our earlier work, we developed a multimodal multi-stream method which leveraged temporal gradient data through knowledge distillation to achieve accurate real-time per frame activity recognition and localization for excavator activities. So far, I've only reviewed the state-of-the-art supervised methods. However, as I mentioned earlier, providing annotated data is also one of the main existing challenges. Reduced dataset methods that try to address this issue can generally be divided into two categories. The first category are the synthetic methods that generate simulated data for training, and the second category are methods that use unlabeled data for training that include approaches like few-shot learning, semi-supervised learning, and self-supervised learning. We can see some samples of the synthetic approaches in these figures that have tried to create simulated data for training using different methods. However, as we can also see, the main problem with these methods is the difference between simulated and real-world data, which limits their applicability. One category of unlabeled data approaches that is getting more attention recently due to the success of large foundation models is few-shot learning. In this figure, we can see a few-shot learning method for equipment detection. In the first step, they trained the model on a base annotated dataset. Afterwards, the trained model was used to learn to detect new equipment with only a few available labeled images. However, the main disadvantage of few-shot learning methods include the dependency of the model performance on the selected few images, and also data leakage for the case of large foundation models, which refers to unintentionally sharing information between the training and testing datasets that can lead to misleadingly high performance during model development but poor performance in the real world. Another category of unlabeled approaches are the semi-supervised learning methods, an example of which we can see in this figure. In this method, there is a teacher network and a student network. The teacher network is trained in a supervised manner using labeled data. Afterward, it provides pseudo-labels on the unlabeled data that are used to train the student network. However, a main drawback of this method is the reliability of the generated pseudo-labels. In other words, since the teacher network itself is trained in a supervised manner, it requires a sufficiently large labeled dataset to produce accurate pseudo-labels. Otherwise, the performance of the model would not be acceptable. Another category of unlabeled approaches are the self-supervised learning methods. In this figure, we can see an earlier self-supervised method that we developed for the task of construction activity recognition. In this method, spatiotemporal information from unlabeled video data were used to train the model in a contrastive learning manner, which basically means that instead of providing labels, the model learns by comparing different data with each other and learning from their similarities and differences. Although this work does not have the drawbacks of the previous few-shot or semi-supervised learning approaches, however, it only applied self-supervised learning to activity recognition and not localization. No research to date has employed unlabeled data to facilitate the localization of construction equipment, even though this step is among the most annotation-intensive processes. As mentioned earlier, a necessary component of construction digital twin systems is the availability of real-time monitoring information that can be provided using stationary and moving cameras. We just reviewed the latest supervised and reduced dataset methods that used videos recorded using stationary cameras. Now, in this section, I will present a brief review of methods that were developed for moving edge devices. Several studies have proposed methods for detecting construction equipment or resources from aerial images. For example, in this slide, we can see a method that was developed by Gu et al. That combined orientation-aware feature fusion with a 2D CNN network for detecting equipment. However, all works in construction only address the task of equipment or resource detection. So to provide a roadmap for future research, I will also present a brief review of methods developed for activity recognition using moving edge devices in the computer vision domain. For example, in this video, we can see a dataset that was developed for human activity recognition using drones, with a method later developed on this dataset using the YOLO version 5 model. However, one of the main challenges for aerial activity recognition is the limited availability of training data compared to stationary methods. For example, in this method, we can see that the authors have used a combination of deep learning and machine learning models instead of training in an end-to-end deep learning model. To address this issue, aerial reduced dataset methods have also been proposed. For example, in this figure, we can see a multitask learning approach that uses the GAN network to transform ground activity video features into their aerial counterparts, combined with synthetically generated videos and a small number of real aerial activity videos. Although this method reduces the need for annotated aerial data, they use domain adaptation from ground videos to aerial videos, a process that inevitably introduces errors. So there is a need in this area for new methods that can directly exploit unlabeled aerial videos to facilitate both activity recognition and localization. So to summarize in this presentation, vision-based construction activity recognition methods were reviewed, including the supervised and reduced dataset methods. Also, a brief review of different reduced dataset methods along with their description and limitation was provided. We also reviewed the previously unexplored area of aerial activity recognition, which is essential for capturing dynamic site conditions. Finally, the existing research gaps, especially for reduced dataset and aerial approaches, were identified that provide future directions for development. Thank you.